A beautiful girl named Rosie marries her own dog at her own will. You're joking, right? Right? She's lost her mind. This isn't normal, it's just not right. The whispers started the moment Rosie made the announcement. A hush had fallen over Willow Creek, the kind that only came when something truly shocking happened. Rosie, the girl everyone admired, the one with hair like golden wheat and eyes like the deep green of summer forests, had always been different. Not in a way that made people worry, but in a way that made them curious. She never cared for gossip, never sought attention, never longed for the affections of men the way other girls did. She was happiest in the open fields, barefoot in the grass, with Duke by her side. Duke wasn't just a dog to Rosie. He was her shadow, her protector, her everything. She had raised him since he was a pup, and in a town where even people could be cruel, Duke had never once let her feel alone. He understood her in ways no one else did. His steady gaze met hers in moments of doubt, his silent presence a comfort when words failed. But when she said it out loud, when she looked straight into the eyes of the town and said, "I'm going to marry Duke. He's the only one who's ever truly loved me," the world around her cracked open. People gasped. Some laughed, thinking it was a joke. Others whispered in fear, as if she had spoken some forbidden spell. "Rosie, sweetheart, you don't mean that," her mother said, her voice trembling. But Rosie just smiled softly, sadly. She meant every word. She had seen too much heartbreak in this town, too many broken promises, too many women who gave their hearts to men who only knew how to shatter them. Rosie didn't want that. She wanted loyalty. She wanted a love that wouldn't fade, wouldn't betray, wouldn't hurt. And Duke had always been there, always. "This isn't right, Rosie," someone in the crowd muttered. It's unnatural." "What's unnatural about love?" Rosie asked, her voice steady but her heart pounding. "I don't need anyone's permission to choose who I love." The town stood still, caught between disbelief and something else, something they didn't want to admit. Fear. Fear of what this meant. Fear that maybe, just maybe, Rosie wasn't the crazy one after all. And so the town of Willow Creek watched in silence as Rosie turned away, Duke trotting faithfully beside her, tail wagging. She had made her choice. And soon the world would have no choice but to understand. Life in Willow Creek didn't just move on after Rosie's shocking declaration. No, the town had never been good at forgetting things. People whispered behind closed doors, neighbors watched her with cautious glances, and her parents, well, they prayed that this was just a phase, a passing storm in their daughter's life. But Rosie didn't care. She carried on as if nothing had changed, walking through the fields with Duke, laughing with him, whispering secrets to him as if he were the only one in the world who truly listened. And in many ways he was. Then something strange happened. Rosie started to feel off. It began with exhaustion, not the kind that a good night's sleep could fix, but the kind that felt like she was dragging the weight of the world behind her. Her limbs ached, her stomach twisted in knots, and sometimes in the dead of night, she woke up gasping for breath, her skin slick with sweat. At first, she ignored it. Maybe it was stress, maybe it was just the town pressing down on her, suffocating her with their judgment. But then came the nausea. Violent, unrelenting, knocking her to her knees in the mornings. She couldn't eat without feeling sick. Even the smell of her favorite foods made her stomach churn. And the worst part, the fear creeping into her heart. Because deep down, somewhere in the place where logic and dreams fought for control, she already knew the answer. Something was growing inside of her. She didn't want to believe it. She couldn't believe it. Her hands trembled as she stood in front of the mirror one evening, pulling up the hem of her dress, pressing her fingers against her stomach. It was subtle, but undeniable. A change. A swelling. Something was there. There. Her mind screamed at her to find another explanation, any explanation. Maybe she was sick. Maybe it was something else, something normal. Because the alternative was impossible. It had to be. But the sickness didn't stop. The dizziness got worse. And then, the final confirmation came, a missed cycle, a truth she could no longer run from. Rosie was pregnant. And there was no one to blame. No man, no secret lover, no explanation that made sense. There was only Duke. And in that terrifying moment, standing in her bedroom, hands gripping the edge of her dresser to keep herself steady, she let the fear consume her. Because if this was real, if this was truly happening, then the world was about to change in ways it had never imagined. Rosie tried to keep it a secret. For weeks, she wore looser dresses, forced herself to smile through the exhaustion, and avoided lingering too long in town where curious eyes could watch her every move. But no secret stayed hidden in Willow Creek for long. It started with whispers. "She's been looking pale lately. Did you see how she held her stomach the other day? Something's not right with that girl." Then, the rumors took shape. The town's baker, Mrs. Caldwell, swore she had seen Rosie rush behind her shop one morning and vomit into the bushes. Old Mr. Harris, who never missed a thing from his rocking chair outside the general store, noticed how she walked slower, like she was carrying an invisible burden. But the moment everything changed, it was when Rosie fainted. It happened right in the middle of Sunday service. The air was thick with the scent of candle wax and aged wood as the town sat in the old chapel, listening to the preacher speak of righteousness and sin. And then, without warning, Rosie collapsed. Gasps filled the room. Women rushed forward. Someone shouted for water. Duke, who had been waiting patiently outside, suddenly barked and scratched at the chapel doors like he could sense something was wrong. When Rosie came to, she found herself staring into a sea of worried faces. Her mother was at her side, eyes wet with unshed tears. The preacher stood nearby, his expression tight with something between concern and suspicion. And then, the question fell like a hammer. "Rosie, are you with child?" The room went silent. Rosie's breath hitched in her throat. She could feel every pair of eyes on her, burning with curiosity, with judgment. She wanted to lie, to say no, to pretend nothing was happening. But her hand drifted to her stomach before she could stop it. The silence cracked into chaos. "Who is the father?" someone demanded. "She's never been seen with a man. Lord help us, it must be some kind of miracle. Or a curse." The weight of the accusations pressed down on her. She had no answer to give, because the truth was worse than anything they could imagine. The preacher took a step forward, his voice lower now, more cautious. "Rosie, child, if you are with child, we must know the father. You are not alone in this. We will help you, but we need to understand." Rosie's lips trembled. She turned her head toward the chapel doors where Duke waited. Faithful, loyal, the only soul in the world who had never abandoned her. And in that moment she knew. No one would believe her. No one would accept the truth. So she did the only thing she could. She ran. Then, with gasps and shouts rising behind her, she pushed herself up, darted through the chapel doors, and ran straight into the open air, where Duke was waiting. The moment he saw her, he fell into step beside her, as if he already knew. As if he had always known. Rosie didn't stop running until she reached the edge of town, where the fields stretched endlessly and the sky felt bigger than her fears. Duke ran beside her, his heavy paws thudding against the earth, his breath steady while hers was ragged. She collapsed beneath the old oak tree, hands gripping her stomach, her heart pounding with a truth too impossible to exist. Pregnant. And no father. No man had touched her, no secret lover, no mistake from a foolish night. Only Duke had ever been there. Tears burned her eyes as she whispered, "What's happening to me?" Duke pressed his cold nose against her arm, his deep brown eyes filled with something, knowing, protective, almost human. Rosie shivered. Ah. She didn't know how long she sat there, but eventually a shadow fell over her. Rosie. She looked up to find Dr. Whitmore, the town's only physician, standing a few feet away, hands in his pockets, his face unreadable. Everyone knew Dr. Whitmore wasn't just a country doctor. He had studied in big cities before choosing a quieter life in Willow Creek. He had seen things the town couldn't even imagine. "I heard what happened at church," he said, kneeling beside her. "Come with me." The examination. Rosie sat in Dr. Whitmore's small clinic, her fingers clutching the edge of the examination table as he ran his tests. Blood work, scans, questions she couldn't answer. She felt like she was floating outside her body, watching from a distance as he frowned at his findings, as he flipped through books and muttered things under his breath. Then, finally, he turned to her. And in his eyes, she saw something she had never seen before. Fear. "Rosie," he began carefully, like he was afraid of his own words, "you are pregnant. There's no doubt about that." She swallowed hard, her nails digging into the fabric of her dress. "I know." He hesitated. "Then, but there's something else." The air in the room seemed to shrink. "I ran your blood work twice," he continued, his voice quieter now, like he was afraid of what he was about to say. "Rosie, your pregnancy doesn't make sense." A cold chill ran down her spine. "What do you mean?" Dr. Whitmore rubbed his forehead, his breath slow and controlled, like a man trying to reason with the impossible. "There's no male DNA in the sample," he said. "None. Your body is carrying a child, but it's as if the pregnancy formed without a father." Rosie stared at him. The words didn't even seem real. That's not possible," she whispered. "No, it isn't," he exhaled sharply, "but it's happening." A silence stretched between them. Then, cautiously, he asked, "Rosie, tell me the truth. Who have you been with?" Her lips trembled. She wanted to tell him. She wanted to scream it. But how could she? How could she say the name that had been by her side since childhood? How could she say Duke? Her throat closed up. She dropped her gaze. Dr. Whitmore sighed. "Listen, I won't judge you, but this is something bigger than either of us. If we can figure out how this happened, we can." A low growl filled the room. Dr. Whitmore froze. Rosie turned her head slowly. Duke was standing at the door. His body was tense, his eyes locked onto the doctor. And for the first time in her life, Rosie wasn't sure if the look in Duke's eyes was that of a dog anymore. It was something else. Something older. Something watching. Something that had been waiting. That. And Rosie suddenly knew she wasn't the only one who had a secret. This section introduces the mystery of the pregnancy as a biological impossibility while hinting at a deeper, possibly supernatural or scientific anomaly. Should we continue to point 5, family dynamics? Rosie returned home that evening, her mind spinning with Dr. Whitmore's words. How could this be real? Was she losing her grip on reality? As she stepped through the creaky front door, her mother was waiting in the dimly lit kitchen, her face drawn and weary. Her father sat at the table, staring into his hands, his knuckles white against the wood. The house felt heavy, like the walls themselves were pressing in, demanding answers. Rosie, her mother's voice was soft but firm, the kind that held back a flood of emotion. "We need to talk." Rosie nodded numbly and sat across from them, Duke lying faithfully by her feet, his head resting on his paws, watching every move. Her father cleared his throat, his eyes searching hers for a truth he was afraid to find. "We heard what happened at church. And Dr. Whitmore, he told us." His voice broke, and he looked away. Her mother reached across the table, her hand trembling as it clasped Rosie's. "Please, sweetheart. We need to understand. We need to help you. Just tell us who did this to you." Rosie felt her throat tighten. She wanted to spill everything, to let them in on the fear, the confusion that clawed at her heart. But how could she? How could she explain the unexplainable? I don't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her father slammed his fist on the table, making everyone jump. Duke's ears perked up, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "Don't lie to us, Rosie," he shouted, his eyes shining with tears he refused to shed. "We raised you better than this. You think we don't see what's happening? The town's already talking. You're dragging this family's name through the mud." Her mother's face crumpled, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Please, Rosie, just tell us the truth. We can protect you." But Rosie couldn't speak. Her gaze dropped to Duke, who looked back at her with a calmness that unsettled her. There was something in his eyes, something knowing. Her mother followed her gaze, her eyes flicking between Rosie and Duke, a flicker of realization dawning. She pressed a hand to her mouth, her voice a strangled whisper. "No, it can't be. Rosie, tell me you haven't." Rosie's head shot up, horror and disbelief colliding in her chest. No, it's not like that." But the damage was done. Her father's face twisted in a mixture of anger and disgust, and he stood up abruptly, knocking over his chair. "You'll stay in this house until we figure out what to do," he commanded, his voice cold and final. "I won't have this family's name ruined by foolishness." Rosie felt her world crumbling. Her parents, the people who had always been her foundation, were now a part of the confusion that threatened to consume her. That night, as she lay in bed, Duke curled at her feet. She couldn't stop the tears that spilled onto her pillow. Her family was slipping away. The town had turned against her, and even she didn't understand what was happening. All she had was Duke. And a growing fear that maybe, just maybe, she didn't know him at all. The days after that conversation felt like a slow, suffocating nightmare. Rosie wasn't allowed to leave the house anymore. Her father's strict command turned their home into a prison. The townspeople were already talking, whispering about her, making up their own stories. And until they had answers, her parents wanted her hidden away, as if keeping her behind walls would erase what had already happened. Her mother barely spoke to her. Her father wouldn't even look at her. The warmth that once filled their small home was gone, replaced by tension, by stares filled with unanswered questions, by an unbearable silence that stretched through every meal, every shared space. The worst part, Rosie had no one to turn to. Not a single friend came knocking. Not a single comforting voice called her name. And Duke was the only one who stayed. Whenever she cried, he was there, pressing his large head into her lap, watching her with those deep, understanding eyes. When she lay awake at night, drowning in the weight of her thoughts, Duke curled beside her, his steady breathing the only thing keeping her from feeling completely lost. But something felt different. She started noticing it in small ways. The way he looked at her. Not like a pet looks at its owner. Not with the playfulness of a dog that wanted to chase birds or roll in the grass. No, his gaze felt heavier now, more human, more knowing. There were nights when she woke up suddenly, without knowing why, only to find Duke staring at her in the dark, watching. Like he was waiting. For what, she didn't know. Then, there were the dreams. Strange, vivid dreams of running through endless forests, of eyes watching from the shadows, of voices whispering in a language she didn't understand. She would wake up with her heart pounding, breathless, and find Duke still beside her, his body unnervingly still. Her isolation was turning into something worse. She wasn't just losing her family, she was losing herself. And deep down, she knew. Something was coming. Something she couldn't escape. The more time Rosie spent in isolation, the more she began to see Duke differently. He wasn't just her childhood companion anymore. Something about him had changed. He was always there, always watching. Not like a dog, not like a pet, but like something else entirely. His eyes felt too knowing, his presence too deliberate. It wasn't just loyalty anymore. It was something deeper. One evening, as she sat curled up on the bed, staring out the window at the town she could no longer be a part of, she felt it again, his eyes on her. She turned slowly. Duke sat at the foot of her bed, completely still, his gaze locked onto her, unblinking. A chill ran down her spine. "Duke," she whispered, half expecting him to respond, half dreading that he might. His ears flicked, but he didn't look away. Rosie swallowed hard. Something inside her, something primal, told her to break eye contact, to not challenge him, but she couldn't look away. The silence in the room grew heavier, stretching between them like something tangible. And then, for the first time in her life, she felt afraid of him. Not in a way that made her want to run, but in a way that made her wonder if she ever really knew him at all. That night, the dreams came stronger. She was running, barefoot through the woods. The wind howled through the trees, whispering in a language she couldn't understand. Her breath came in sharp gasps, her heart racing, but she wasn't alone. Something was behind her. Something big, something running with her. Not chasing, guiding. She could hear it, the heavy breathing, the powerful stride beside her. She turned her head in the dream, just for a second, and saw. Golden eyes, burning, watching, claiming. She jolted awake, a scream caught in her throat. Duke was sitting at the edge of the bed, staring at her. Like he had been waiting. Her hand trembled as she reached for her stomach. The life inside her felt stronger now, more present, more real. And for the first time, she whispered a truth she wasn't ready to accept. "Duke, what are you?" He didn't move, didn't blink. But in the silence of the room, in the slow tilt of his head, she swore she saw him smile. The next morning, Rosie woke up to something different. Silence. Not the usual morning quiet, the kind that felt unnatural, heavy, like the world was holding its breath. She sat up, scanning the room. Duke wasn't at the foot of her bed. Her stomach twisted. He was always there. A sudden knock at the door made her jump. She hesitated before answering. Her parents had barely spoken to her for days. Who could it be? She opened the door slowly and froze. Dr. Whitmore stood there. He looked different. Tired. Pale. Uneasy. Like he had spent the night unraveling something that refused to make sense. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice low, privately. Rosie swallowed hard but stepped aside. As soon as the door shut, he turned to her. "Rosie, I need you to tell me everything about Duke." Her heart pounded. "What do you mean?" Dr. Whitmore rubbed a hand over his face, like he was trying to hold himself together. "After you left my office, I kept looking into your test results. I even sent them to a colleague in the city. And Rosie, something is wrong." She clenched her fists. "I know." "No." He shook his head. "You don't know. Your pregnancy, it's not just impossible. It's unnatural." A cold shiver ran down her spine. "What do you mean?" Dr. Whitmore hesitated, glancing at the door like he was afraid someone might be listening. Then, carefully, he pulled a piece of paper from his coat pocket. A test result. He pointed at a section she didn't understand. "Your baby's DNA, it's not fully human." Her breath hitched. She felt the room spin. What? What? He met her eyes, his own filled with something between fear and urgency. "Rosie, I've seen rare mutations before. I've seen things that defy explanation. But this is something else entirely." She backed away, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. No, this wasn't real. But deep down, something inside her already knew the truth. Dr. Whitmore's voice softened. "Rosie, where did Duke come from?" She stared at him, her mouth dry. She had never asked, never thought about it. Duke had always been there, since she was a child, since before she could remember. Her parents said he showed up one day, just a small black puppy on their doorstep. A stray. But Duke was never like other dogs. And now, staring at Dr. Whitmore, staring at the paper in his hands, staring at the evidence that something was growing inside her that wasn't fully human, Rosie felt her world shatter. A sudden gust of wind blew through the room, rattling the windows. Dr. Whitmore's head snapped up. What was that? But Rosie wasn't listening anymore. Her ears were ringing, her vision blurred. Because she knew where Duke was. She didn't know how, but she felt it. He was waiting for her. And for the first time, she knew he had been waiting all along. She turned, grabbing her coat, ignoring Dr. Whitmore's protests. She ran out the door, her heart pounding, her pulse screaming with a truth she had ignored for too long. She had to find him. She had to know. She had to face what Duke really was. Rosie ran. Through the empty streets of Willow Creek, past the watchful eyes peeking from behind curtains, past the murmurs and gasps of the townspeople who knew something was wrong, but didn't dare say it aloud. She didn't stop until she reached the woods. The place she always felt safest. The place Duke always led her to. But tonight, the trees felt taller, the shadows darker. The wind howled through the branches like a whisper of warning. And there, in the clearing beneath the pale silver moon, Duke was waiting. Not sitting, not wagging his tail. Just standing, still, watching. His golden eyes glowed unnaturally, reflecting the light in an almost human way. Rosie's breath hitched as she stepped forward. Duke. He didn't move. But she felt something shift. Not physically, something deeper, something in the air itself. The wind died. The trees stilled. The world around them seemed to hold its breath. Then, without a sound, Duke began to change. Rosie's heart pounded as his black fur rippled like liquid shadow, his body stretching, shifting not like an animal, not like anything she had ever seen before. His bones cracked, his spine elongated, his front legs straightened until they were no longer paws but hands. And standing before her was no longer Duke. It was a man. Tall, dark, with eyes that burned like molten gold, not human, not fully. Something older, something more. Rosie's knees buckled, and she staggered back. Her entire world crumbled in that instant. Her voice broke. "You're not a dog." The man Duke tilted his head the same way he always did, the way Duke had always done. "I never was," he said softly. His voice was deep, smooth, ancient. Rosie shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "This isn't real. This isn't." Duke took a step forward. She could feel the power radiating off him. "Rosie," he murmured, his voice carrying something strange, something unspoken. "You already knew, didn't you?" She clenched her fists, her stomach twisting. The connection she felt to him, the way he always understood her, the way he wasn't like other dogs. And now the child inside her. Her mind screamed at her to run, to escape. But her body, it stayed. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she whispered, "What are you?" Duke's golden eyes flickered with something almost sad. "I was sent here," he said simply, "to watch over you." Rosie's breath caught. "Sent?" Duke took another step, but I was never meant to interfere. His jaw tightened. "Until I did." She clutched her stomach, her fingers trembling. "This baby, this isn't." "You are carrying something the world has never seen," he said, his voice heavy. "Something that was never meant to be." The wind picked up again, howling through the trees, the sky darkening with unseen forces pressing in. Rosie's heart stopped as a realization crashed over her. This wasn't just about her. This wasn't just about Duke. Something else was coming. Something bigger, something powerful. And this child was the key to it all. Rosie didn't sleep that night. After Duke or whatever he was had revealed himself, she couldn't bring herself to return home. Instead, she sat beneath the old oak tree, clutching her stomach, feeling the life inside her move in ways that no child should. Her mind was a storm. She had spent her entire life thinking Duke was just a dog. Now he was standing before her as something more. Something not of this world. And worst of all, her child was connected to it. Morning came, but the weight of the night before hadn't lifted. She knew she couldn't hide forever. The town was already suspicious. And as soon as she stepped back into Willow Creek, she realized the worst had already begun. People were outside their homes, whispering in hushed voices. They weren't even trying to be discreet anymore. She heard them. She disappeared last night. Her father's been looking for her. Did you hear what the doctor said? Her baby isn't normal. She's been cursed. Rosie forced herself to keep walking. Her hands trembled, but she kept moving. She barely made it to her house before the first person stepped forward. It was Mrs. Caldwell, the baker, her kind eyes now sharp with fear. "Rosie, sweetheart, tell me it's not true." Rosie froze. What? What? Another voice, the preacher. "Tell us, child, who is the father of your baby?" She opened her mouth, but no words came. What could she say? The crowd was growing. More people were stepping forward now. Some looked concerned. Most looked afraid. Her father burst through the front door, his face red with rage. "Rosie." His voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. "Where have you been?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. But the silence, the hesitation was enough. The town had already decided. The preacher took a deep breath, then spoke the words that sealed her fate. "This child is not natural." Gasps rippled through the crowd. A woman clutched her rosary. "This isn't just sin," the preacher continued, stepping closer. "This is something far worse. Demonic. Unholy. A curse on their town." "No," Rosie whispered, stepping back. "It's not like that." But no one was listening anymore. "That dog has always been strange," someone muttered. "She always treated him like he was more than just an animal. Maybe she isn't even human anymore." The fear in their voices was growing. Fear had a way of turning into something dangerous. Her mother's voice cracked through the crowd. "Rosie, please, tell them the truth before it's too late." Rosie turned, desperate, searching for Duke, but he was gone. For the first time in her life, he wasn't there. She was alone. The preacher's voice thundered. "We cannot allow this blasphemy to remain among us." Rosie's stomach twisted. The weight of the moment suffocated her. And in that second, she knew they weren't going to let her stay. The town was turning against her. The town had made its decision. Rosie could see it in their eyes: fear, disgust, and something far worse, conviction. This wasn't just about whispers anymore. This wasn't just about judgment. They wanted her gone. Someone grabbed her wrist. Her father. His grip was tight, almost bruising. "We need to fix this," he said, his voice shaking, his own fear bleeding through his anger. "You need to repent." The preacher stepped forward, clutching his Bible like a weapon. "This is an abomination," he declared. "This child, whatever it is, must not be born." Rosie's breath caught in her throat. They weren't just casting her out. They were going to end it. Panic surged through her veins. "No," she choked out, trying to pull away. "Please." The crowd closed in. Someone grabbed her other arm. Her mother was crying, her hands clasped in prayer, whispering something Rosie couldn't hear. Everything was unraveling. Then the wind changed. A low, guttural growl echoed through the air. And suddenly, Duke was there. But not as a dog. As a dog. Not as the man she had seen in the woods. As something else entirely. A figure emerged from the tree line, tall and terrifyingly otherworldly. Shadows clung to his skin like living tendrils. His golden eyes burned brighter than before, casting a glow that made the torches in the villagers' hands look dim. The moment he stepped forward, the temperature dropped. The air grew thick, charged with something unnatural. People stumbled back. Gasps, cries of terror. The preacher clutched his cross, his lips trembling. What is that? You are afraid of what you don't understand. Duke's voice was smooth, not human. It rumbled through the air, thick with power. Rosie could barely breathe. The crowd was frozen, trapped between fear and the reality of what stood before them. Rosie's father still held onto her arm, but his grip had loosened. This was her chance. With one sharp movement, she broke free. She ran. Straight into the dark, toward Duke, toward the only thing that had ever truly protected her. The second she reached him, the wind howled through the town, rattling windows, shaking the earth itself. Duke turned, his eyes locking onto hers. "Are you ready?" he asked. She didn't know what he meant. She didn't understand what was happening. But she nodded. Because the only thing she knew for sure was that she couldn't stay here. Duke raised his hand or claw, or something in between. And then everything changed. The wind roared, a force unlike anything Rosie had ever felt ripped through the town. And then darkness. When Rosie opened her eyes again, Willow Creek was gone. She stood in a place she didn't recognize. A place that didn't feel like Earth. Duke was beside her, still watching, still waiting. Rosie looked down at her stomach. The life inside her pulsed with energy, stronger than before. She wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't lost. She was becoming something else. Something the world had never seen before. And she knew this was only the beginning.